All right, hello everyone. Welcome. It's truly a great pleasure for me to introduce Amale Andraos tonight, the new First Lady Dean of Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, and since 2003, a partner in the firm WORKac with Dan Wood. I think her recent dean appointment is extremely exciting for the field and for the future of pedagogy in this country. And what makes it that, for me, is that Amale is a key figure in and a representative of a generation of architects and pedagogues who try to have it all, who, as the previous dean of Columbia has said, refuse any strong distinction between practice, research, analysis, and publications. Of course, if you know Wigley, it makes sense that he would like this definition of practice, and I agree with him, as I often do. But I want to add that on top of insisting on having it all, the office, kids, socially engaged work, environment, compelling forms, visionary cities, and humor, WORKac has developed a coherent body of work and a position which has been particularly difficult for the generation whose production has spanned extremely different historical and economic moments: opportunism of the building boom, the dry spell of the crash, and the prospect of constant crisis of scarcity and ecological demise. And I won't go into the body of work that has, in a decade, gone from a speculative house for an urban dog through the PS1 farm, enlightened food-producing schools in New York, speculative projects on urban form and life in Beirut, St. Petersburg, and Kaiser, Oregon, museums for children and of sex, to the Assembly Hall in Gabon. I will leave those stories to Amale. But what I want to leave you with is a notion that WORKac's body of work is recognizably that, a body of work, precisely in its specific mixture of earnestness and humor, ability to travel from serious to light and back again through architecture gracefully, though always in character, which makes it hard to discuss, but which I think carves out ways to be optimistic in the most down-to-earth and sometimes dire situations. It is a kind of outlook, and I hope Dan will forgive me for this, it's good he's not here, that is specifically Beiruti. And by that, I mean a kind of posture or style analogous to the one the city and citizens of Beirut have had to develop in order to endure against dire odds. Amale has lived and worked in other countries too, Saudi Arabia, France, Canada, Holland, and obviously not all of WORKac's work and attitude can be explained by Beirut's cultural psychology. So here's something a bit more precise than my crackpot theory on Beirutism. As a critic and a friend, maybe this is a question to you to leave with. As a critic and a friend, I am curious to see how Amale's new role as the captain of Columbia's architecture school will affect both her and her office's particular and so far consistent mix of earnest care for social environmental issues, optimism about architecture's role in addressing those, and humor about architects taking themselves too seriously. With that, I give you Amale.
Thank you, Anna. We can discuss later. I'm going to stand here, I think. Can you see me, or should I stand on the other side? Is this better? That's good, right? So I'm here in my capacity as Principal of WORKac since it's only been 8 weeks that I'm the Dean at Columbia, and it would be kind of maybe too soon to posit any strong sense of a vision for the school, although I'm quite excited, obviously, about it. And so today, the title is Architecture as Diplomacy, and I'll try to kind of set an introduction and then have the body of work, even though the two are kind of living sort of in parallel, the introduction being a question that I started to explore more recently through teaching. Despite the last contestation of meaning that was produced by postmodern thinking in the West, where a large number of architects brought back the question of symbolic representation in an effort to undermine modernism's claim that form followed function, either through postmodern architecture's renewed commitment to symbolic meaning understood as relative, referential, and historical, such as with the iteration of its architectural elements, or through a re-engaging of the urban landscape as one of signs and symbols, or through deconstructivist architecture's untangling of the relationship between form and function, rendering stable meaning and functional legibility impossible, either replacing the legibility of symbolic reference by a legibility of process through formal deconstruction, or again, through the unlocking of the form-function equation by focusing on function as event, to be reinvented and often represented as a fragmented and destabilized body, such as with Chumi's work. Or again, by flipping the modernist plan into a section that allows an endless ability to produce surrealist effects, again, a manifesto against the conscious production of collective meaning, as it both connects and separates highly disparate programs. Interestingly, 1978 is the same year that Delirious New York was published, and Edward Said publishes his Orientalism, which instead finds and deconstructs meaning in all of the representations of the Orient, always and collectively depicted as inferior, irrational, and only animated by religion. Today, so everything from kind of interior work to entire cities as defined by this kind of lens of the religious. Today, with the prevalence of global practice, it seems that meaning is again everywhere, but nowhere engaged as critical discourse, with no clear debate as to the content that we as architects continue to produce. We all know the drill. In China, you either try to produce a kind of figure 8 or a symbol that means the people. You can kind of engage with stadiums as the metaphor bird's nest, the building as a kind of sail, kind of evoking the historical past of fishing for pearls in the Gulf of the Gulf states. In Africa, you go tribal patterns. And even when meaning is not intended, it is expected and projected onto kind of contemporary production. This situation is particularly bad, I would say, in the Middle East, where orientalizing kind of plans and buildings, so for example, a museum as flower of the desert or as oasis, the kind of the contemporary city as traditional Arab city, and the kind of idea of the pattern no longer generative but entirely decorative, etc., etc. The condition has become really kind of absurd. Nizar al-Sayyad writes in his essay From Modernism to Globalization, the Middle Eastern context, the global will be the century of representation. The more global we become, the more anxious questions of identity remain. I'm just not sure about that, but it's an interesting kind of position. Many of those examples are not just Orientalists in the way they reduce and trivialize a culture, rendering it incapable of escaping its superstitious, primordial, or religious roots. They constitute, in fact, a reverse Orientalism, which, as anthropologist Ahmed Khanna describes in his book Dubai, the City as Corporation, where one-liner reductive motifs are used by local ruling elites to simultaneously sell a constructed authenticity of the world while also constructing the myth of an original, authentic, and pure identity at the exclusion of many others. A great example of this can be found in what Suleiman Khalaf describes in his article Camel Racing in the Gulf, where he notes the evolution of that sport, camel racing, as entirely constructed to demonstrate the ruling family in the UAE's active sponsoring of a kind of they're demonstrating their ability to maintain tradition while embracing a kind of idea of modernity at the same time. How then do we acknowledge this continued desire for representation while moving beyond the false debate between the highly local and the global? How do we start articulating again in similar but also in different ways an architectural position vis-à-vis this question of representation and meaning? Should we, and if so, why and how? Echoing Timothy Mitchell in his essay, The Stage of Modernity, I would like to propose that we abandon any notion of a local that is original, authentic, and pure in contrast to or outside of the global. The notion of a real that is out there, better or worse than its representation, is an effect of modernity, a modernity that is always already contaminated by what it excludes. In fact, the colonized was always already modernity. And so I would say that our hybrid identities as architects matches the hybrid conditions that architecture has always been the result of, or at least the kinds of contaminated, hybridized architectures that we find inspiring, we as kind of WORKac. From the Roman ruins of Palmyra and Petra to the embrace of a hybrid modernism, the Beiruti effect, as an expression of national emergence, or the experiments in tropical modernism, and later that kind of embrace of kind of environmental sort of expression that we have found very interesting in our work throughout the 70s and the 80s. This condition of patient sort of negotiation, of exchange, of subtle etiquette, a mix of idealism and pragmatism, and slight compromises that come to new resolutions and new positions that are more and go beyond the first two that are already known, is this condition that I'd like to describe as diplomacy, which is often for us represented by some of the kind of more beautiful embassies that negotiated the kind of difference of cultural context. The condition of diplomacy and the representation as embedded within an imperative of cultural diplomacy for architecture is not one of unconditional engagement. It is more like this diagram of the architect and power here, where the diplomat is neither inside nor outside, but in between, a go-between, fully embedded, powerless, powerful, and always at risk of failing, actually failing constantly, and yet there's the quality of the conversation and the possibility to start a conversation or change the current conversation. And for us specifically, and for, I would say, the past 5 years, this conversation has revolved around that of the environment, or at least an idea of representing, exploring, and possibly reinventing the relationship between the urban, the rural, and the natural as they intersect with the architectural. And this is Dan trying to make that point as he's selling one of our books at the farmers market on architecture and agriculture. And so the next series of projects are kind of describing this engagement that we've had to, as diplomats or thinking about architecture as diplomacy, try to negotiate through architecture the relationships between, let's say, the urban, the rural, and the natural. And the first project I'd like to start with is a project we did called Nature City, which was the result of being invited to for MoMA and the exhibition Foreclosed, Rehousing the American Dream. We were part of a group of 5 teams that thought to reinvent, let's say, the American suburb in light of the foreclosure crisis. We chose as our site Kaiser in Oregon, and one of the things that attracted us to that site is that we felt that the kind of suburb could be really examined through Oregon, and the idea of something the suburb as something positive, as it was first, let's say, imagined by Ebenezer Howard as something that could be the best of, let's say, the urban and the natural brought together. And we wanted to kind of really seriously take that sort of dream of bringing the two together, but reinvent it for the 21st century. Some of the kind of ideas we were interested in was really understanding the relationship between the built and the unbuilt in the way that they evolved, where, let's say, the ratio of green to, which is here the gray, but what each house comes with as a kind of lot of green sort of has evolved to really become incredibly dense, where the scale of the house and the scale of the green have kind of gone in like opposite directions. And the second important point was how could we expand the typologies of housing in the kind of typical American suburb, which are quite limited and usually dictated by mortgages and kind of banks, etc. So Kaiser is a typical American suburb, as you would imagine it, a sort of bedroom community for Salem, which is the capital of Oregon, and also for Portland, where people commute to quite often. It also was very interesting for us because Oregon is the only state that has a kind of that works with urban growth boundaries, and you can still kind of read it in the landscape, and that was the site that we chose. And the kind of problematic that was interesting for us is that at the time Kaiser was in negotiation with Salem to expand the urban growth boundary with the idea that 13,000 people were going to move to Kaiser in the next 20 years and that they didn't want to densify. So that was a kind of obvious problem. Could we maintain the quality of life that people who move to Kaiser want while densifying and maintaining the urban growth boundary, which is kind of sort of ground zero for, let's say, a kind of negotiation between the urban and the natural, as we kind of would like to claim it is, or it should be. And here you can actually see in Kaiser that urban growth boundary and that kind of strong edge really, really functioning. Our site was a kind of shopping mall that had been developed in recent years, and so it was easy for us to imagine an alternate to this. So really thinking about the idea of density, of edge, of a really strong negotiation between the built and the green, let's say, we imagined that a minimum of what the minimum of urbanity would be is, let's say, 2 streets, and that if we took the grid as the sort of almost sign for the urban and spread the grid, sort of stretched it, we could insert and create a sort of diagram of grid, green, grid, green, grid, green. And while the grid was really kind of working in the east-west direction, the north-south would be much thinner and much more kind of natural, where the green would be able to pass over and under and create a kind of a new type of grid. So that was a sort of diagram for the project, and we were able to create 5 times the typical suburban density and 3 times the typical open space. That was the kind of sort of looking at the numbers of what we were able to create with that sort of diagram. And so here you see the idea of the north-south kind of green movement versus the east-west, much more urban context. The idea was also to try to differentiate the green. So it ranged from sort of landscapes that would need very little tending, quote-unquote wilder, to a series of much more domesticated landscape that would be connected to the different typologies of housing and create diversity, not just of housing, but of landscapes within each kind of block. The section became very important. How do you pass nature, quote unquote, underneath, over? How do you kind of embed it within? And that was kind of one of the main piers that was developed. And here you see each block highly diverse in terms of its the typology of housing that was created, but also the typology of green that was inserted within. The idea also for the housing in terms of diversifying the typology was that each housing block would also double up as what we call the kind of ecological infrastructure for the site. Meaning if you were going to live in a sort of much more sort of natural environment, you would need to do work for that to be sustainable. And so everything from composting to a fuel cell plant to geothermal kind of capabilities, the housing was also the infrastructure that allowed the whole sort of development to exist in an integrated way. And so that idea of housing as infrastructure kind of generated these sort of new typologies. For instance, this was the kind of water filtering system where instead of a lawn, you would have a kind of pond of water that would also filter the water, so you have a view on the lawn and a view on a little pond. As you can see here with this sort of thin ribbon kind of negotiating the green and the water. Looking at distribution of water and densifying right at the kind of moment where trains would come. We had the kind of water towers where the sort of pressure of the water would be created by the interior of the water tower as the water fell. And so that was a kind of way to reinterpret the core and expand it to become much more of an experience of systems and a celebration of them. And again, working with the kind of typology of a typical suburban home, but now kind of stacked, either stacked or compressed. The big compost mound was where all of the kind of organic waste would come, be composted, produce methane, etc. And that particular sort of typology was interesting for us because it doubled where one ring would be entirely public, so you could actually go up, and the other ring would be more private. So a real weaving of the kind of two systems as you moved up. Sort of, we called it the continuous dog run on the one hand, and then the kind of more private green spaces on the other. And here was the sort of idea of the generic. The generic was kind of the frame around the diverse typologies of houses. And the generic was a kind of compressed typical house where the compression really increased the density without necessarily kind of making a big difference. And the green spaces would be on the roof, so your lawn is sort of on your roof. Which you see here. And these acted as the bridges in the north-south direction. And here you see a model again. And we also liked Oregon because we, at the time, were working with Wyden Kennedy, the ad agency that started in Portland. And so we asked them to actually, make advertisement for Nature City. I'll show just a few, but these were running throughout the exhibition at MoMA. Brought the message home. Show another one.
Doing guy stuff. Dial the number on your screen as he promised to pick up. I'm mostly just like watching videos on YouTube.
The second project is a very different context. It's St. Petersburg, Russia, and we won a competition to design a new master plan for a cultural center in St. Petersburg on an island called New Holland Island, which is the circle there, which is this kind of really interesting, I don't know, it doesn't seem. Interesting triangular island, which Peter the Great sort of carved from the city, and was always, in a way, a kind of void in the city because it was always connected to sort of military operations, always inaccessible to the public, and so this kind of very, very mysterious kind of site in the heart of the city. We, as a kind of World Heritage Monument site, highly protected with very big guidelines in terms of how it would be restored. And nevertheless, our competition came right after another competition which Foster had won, and where he kind of proposed to, for a cultural center, proposed to sort of put a huge building in the center of that kind of void, and had already started to demolish some of the island and some of the structures. And so we came in kind of very much with a sort of earnestness or a sense of that's a void that needed to be preserved, and how could we work with that idea of the void as a kind of way to produce new architecture. Very, very interesting history. So, like I said, from Peter the Great's kind of carving it out from the city to creating sort of these warehouses which were used to dry wood to build ships for the Russian Navy. The first reforming prison, a kind of circular building, was built on the site, and very interestingly, Mendeleev kind of discovered the table of elements there and had a big lab with a big pool, that one of the buildings that kind of Foster demolished when he started to work. One of the things that was really fascinating for Mendeleev was kind of transformation of elements, and he was obsessed with balloons, as we kind of discovered after winning the competition. We had proposed a balloon during the competition, and it was really interesting for us to, kind of engage with these strategies of transformation that are not sort of permanent. And so this was the other building that was also really interesting that had gotten demolished. This was where Lenin first declared the kind of a victory of the revolution from this kind of radio station. So a lot of kind of interesting history to uncover and bring back in kind of non-architectural, typically architectural ways. And so our sort of first instinct was to really open it up, obviously, to the public and create a park. And that would be, in a way, the most radical gesture, just giving access to kind of the people of St. Petersburg to that island, which had been a fortress for so long, and to sort of create this park and make it sort of usable throughout the summer, but also throughout the winter as well. And so one of the ideas was how to keep it really alive even during the winter, and how to kind of bring this kind of idea of the park to the interior of the warehouses. The warehouses are kind of quite amazing because of the kind of need to dry wood vertically. They are sort of built out of these, there's this kind of amazing structure that creates this very intense rhythm where the wood would be kind of put vertically. And so there was already this kind of notion of density that we could, as the island was carved from the rest of the city, we could kind of carving voids through that density to create kind of new kinds of public spaces. And so obviously we kind of we were working within sort of in between two strategies of the void. The first would be kind of Koolhaas's strategies for the void in his bibliothèque. But the second, and maybe closer to what we were trying to do, is Mata Clark's strategy of the void, where the kind of interiority is carved, but in a way to reconnect to the city. So it remains open and not a kind of interior void that you discover. And that was really important for us, that the kind of new carvings would actually allow for new perspectives onto the city and would allow to reconnect the interior of the warehouses to the rest of the city. There was also a really interesting tradition of winter gardens in St. Petersburg, and in particular in the Hermitage, that we thought we would bring back. And so the idea was that by carving these voids in the winter, the park would move inside and create a kind of new public experience, sort of elevated, that would reconnect the island to the city beyond. And that was the sort of initial strategy for the competition, these kinds of carved voids that would be connected with this sort of elevated promenade, which in fact would also allow us to negotiate with the client and create a sandwich where the ground would be public and the roof would be public, and then in between would be whatever residential or offices or whatever the kind of developer program would require. And so as the kind of promenade would weave through, you would have these peaks outside and to the inside, and unable really to create a public experience, even as these warehouses would be distinct programmatically as a result of the kind of requirements for the project. The promenade would double as infrastructure, so carrying people, but actually also carrying all the systems, and being placed at the top allow minimal impact to the kind of structure, which becomes heavier at the bottom. And it would also kind of create a sort of interpretation path. So as you would move through the buildings, you would get a sense of history of the radio station that had disappeared, and kind of different views, etc., onto the island and into the city. So this is just kind of a sequence of spaces connected by this sort of line that would cross the kind of thicknesses and create a sense of continuity. Even as the kind of program from offices to culture to residential would create difference. Just kind of showing some of the plans and the kind of very dense rhythm of the walls, but also the sense of openness at the top. And here you see very much so the sort of incredible rhythm of existing architecture and thickness. And this is where the promenade becomes an arcade at the bottom. And so one of the interesting also aspects of the project in negotiating with the city is that we initially really proposed this only a kind of park that would become hardly a sort of landform and allow for seating in the open part of the city. Of the island, but the kind of landmark commission came back and said that they really believe that the island should maintain the sense of the ensemble and being closed and being different. So it became a sort of negotiation between the outside of the island and the inside, and working to carry the ensemble and close the island again with the building, but then having it connected with the park sort of gave us this kind of part sort of very building on the city side and part park on the island side, which then was sort of designed to hold both seating but also the platform for that famous balloon, which we wanted to put from the beginning to create the possibility of elevating and viewing the city from above without kind of building the Gazprom tower, which was a scandal at the time. And so here you see the kind of park side and then the city side where the building is kind of articulated to allow for entrance, but also sort of is articulated to really carry and close the island again in terms of the profile of the roof. The next project is another kind of cultural project, the competition that we lost for UC Davis, a new museum, that also kind of was a sort of similar negotiation, both between, let's say, building and green, let's say, but also between a highway edge and the campus. So it's incredibly green, UC Davis's campus, and the site right on the kind of edge, negotiating that kind of boundary between the highway and the campus, was quite interesting. Sort of, well, not that interesting, but we could possibly be interesting as we sort of try to use its simplicity, but also engage with this negotiation, let's say, between the highway and the campus to open up a maximum of sort of front open space while creating a strong edge on the highway side. And also to create a possibility for negotiating inside and outside climatically with the sort of perforated canopy. What was interesting about that particular form is that, or shape, is that as it rotates, it gives very, very different sort of perspectives. So from the highway side, the idea was that it would be quite sort of monumental and kind of almost undifferentiated, where the scale of the windows would be quite large. And then as you would rotate, it would come down to the ground and be much more sort of inviting as a scale. And finally, from the entrance, would kind of really open up. And so even though that shape was quite simple, it allowed for quite a lot of different perspectives. And the canopy at the entrance would kind of negotiate the temperature change from inside and outside and create shading. The interior was also a negotiation again between sort of more formalized gallery spaces and more informal art spaces. The museum really wanted to try to attract more students to come. And so while on the one hand you had when you entered you had the kind of formal gallery on the one side, you would also have this kind of stepping new type of display spaces where students can hang out, but also where you could have different new kinds of art being displayed. So much more kind of informal and engaging. And again, with the incredible sort of temperatures and climate of UC Davis, the idea of really sort of cutting through the building with these large kind of green lines, so complete openness cutting through, and perforating it both at the ground level, with a view all through the building and kind of outside artist spaces to spill out and work. And also a kind of cut, another cut at the roof level that would connect the kind of more informal working spaces for the museum. The next project is a project where, again, we looked at a different kind of negotiation between architecture and landscape. This is a competition we did for the National Mall for a new Sylvan Theater, working with Diana Balmori, the landscape. There's many interesting aspects of the mall, but there were three that we were particularly interested in. One was that it had always been a kind of flooding zone, that it had and that kind of environmental concern had never really sort of affected what was designed on it. But two, that what was visible, so that was the kind of invisible story, but the visible story, let's say, is that the mall is really a negotiation between the Macmillan plan, very formal and very classic, classical, let's say, and the more picturesque Downing plan, much more romantic, etc. And you can feel it on the mall. And we wanted to kind of enlist both traditions sort of in the project, and also it being a Sylvan theater. And Sylvan theaters are really interesting because they are sort of clearings in forests. They are kind of moments that you discover. That we wanted to kind of have our new proposal for a Sylvan theater have that same kind of feeling of a kind of discovery within a clearing, let's say. And so looking at this kind of the program was a kind of new little restaurant and exhibition space, visitor center. But for us, it really became about how do we put a structure on the site, not a landform building that doesn't hide the architecture, or at least finds a way to hide it in a new way. And so we really started with the idea of carving the landscape, and sorry, this doesn't work, but really kind of shaping it to create the sort of amphitheater part of the Sylvan theater. So that's the kind of clearing moment. But then really working with the idea of a path and a line, where the line of the landscape would become actually the wiggle of the building, and then would continue to become the line of the landscape that would connect you further to the park. And so that kind of line really became the line of the building, and an idea of thinness, where the negotiation between architecture and landscape wasn't a kind of landform, but was through thinness and an idea of having the trees both be kind of inside and outside, where the building would wrap around the building itself. And the sense of transparency that would be required, let's say, to almost kind of blur the depth between what was inside or behind and what was in front, as playing with the trees. And engaging with this kind of more environmental concern and the fact that it was a sort of restaurant, we enlisted our favorite topic, which is architecture and food, and used the kind of loop of the building to grow food on the roof, and then use the food in the kitchen. But also here, working with Alice Waters, rethink the idea of kitchen and using the continuity of the building to no longer have kitchen behind closed doors and restaurant in front, but rather a continuous experience between food, cooking, sitting, and viewing the sort of performances outside. And then composting again through kind of the circular motion of the building. So here, kind of a continuity between kitchen and eating, and then, of course, the kind of planting pattern on the roof. And so this was kind of the arrival at the top of the amphitheater, sort of completely carved from the landscape, and then the interior of the courtyards with the trees. And that was the model. Continuing with the architecture and food idea, which we've been working on since winning the 2008 YAP competition at PS1 MoMA, where we proposed a kind of cardboard farm tube, a quarter acre of organic farm, to some of the kind of other more sort of visionary sort of propositions for new condominium buildings in New York, ideas of kind of fish farms, etc., or transforming a kind of area of Brooklyn into transforming the streets or negating the streets to become entirely farms. So we've been kind of working on that for some time. But as a result of PS1, we were sort of commissioned to do a series of edible schoolyards in New York. The first one was just completed in Brooklyn and at the public school called PS 216. We started with the garden, which was really interesting in the sense that the children were able to engage with the garden before the structure sort of was built. And so the first kind of structure was the outdoor kitchen classroom that they worked with for a year or so before we designed the actual building itself, which is a sort of greenhouse, a kitchen classroom, and what we call a systems wall. The idea was that this would talking about pedagogy, would really be a sort of a tool for kids' engagement with a kind of almost a pedagogical tool, where everything was shaped to explain how things worked. So the greenhouse and the building roof kind of follow the same slope, where the water flows from the greenhouse to the roof to the cistern. The cistern is circular. The compost is in the systems wall, the tool shed as well. All of the systems are contained in that kind of systems wall, and then the sense of connection between the kind of garden and the building are sort of experienced throughout the use of the building. And that's the building complete. So here you see the sort of Russian doll of the greenhouse, the building, and the systems wall, and the garden in the winter, which is not very green in this drawing. And the systems wall is kind of tall and short. Thank you. I usually don't use these, but today this was kind of the mechanical part of the wall, the cistern, the tool shed, and the composting all in here. And here you see it kind of from the back. And so working on the facade, the school has these really interesting and, well, kind of beautiful sort of graffiti walls where the kids paint. And so we wanted to enlist that feeling and went back to one of our our favorite buildings that are a little kitsch, but nevertheless we love them, which are the best stores that site designed, where, you know, kind of trees and buildings are brought together. And in particular, our favorite flower pattern, which is Venturi Scott Brown's flower pattern for one of these best stores, so kind of engaging already with some of the ideas of, you know, representing nature within kind of architecture. And so we kind of reinterpreted that pattern and used residential shingles that kind of are stacked slightly differently, but to create a sort of pixelated version of that Venturi Scott Brown best store pattern, which you see here. And that's the greenhouse. And what's really been fun is that it's really a classroom. It's integrated within the curriculum, and so when kids learn about a certain culture, etc., they come and they cook the food of that geography, and so it's very kind of integrated and part of the school. How are we doing on time? Are we okay? So literally, architecture and diplomacy is the competition we won 2 years ago to design a new conference center in Gabon, in West Africa here. And the project, the kind of mission, let's say, for the project was really to create a new diplomatic center, mostly for the African Union, but also for diplomatic kind of conferences that Gabon will host and in the future, as it is a kind of emerging country and wants to claim a sort of political importance in Africa to become a real player. How to represent Gabon was part of the question, let's say, of the competition. And for us, the most inspiring aspect of the country is really both the diversity and beauty of its kind of landscapes, but also its city, where it's Libreville, the capital, is really incredibly dense and kind of on the water, and leaving the rest of the country to be quite undeveloped. There's also, as in many African countries, a great tradition of modernism, and especially this kind of both tropical modernism, but also really interesting kind of buildings that were built in the 80s, and this is kind of engagement with the outdoors, and a kind of real kind of expression and between inside and outside. Another really interesting discovery was the fact that the master plan was designed by this Italian architect called De Olivo, who was a friend of Paolo Soleri, and really sort of interested in, he called it the kind of organic urbanism, or the integration of kind of ecology and urbanism. So it was very interesting for us to have that figure in the history of the country that already was sort of trying to integrate the two. And so here you see the sort of very kind of his way of creating that sort of integration. He designed this incredible open-air market that unfortunately was recently destroyed, but was kind of appropriated for a lot of fun kind of events in a very informal way. The site for the project is a kind of diplomatic park which sits above Libreville, so you see the city from there. And it's the actual site of the building here is on the almost the kind of, it's one of the higher points, so you really can see it as you come down, move up from the city into the park. And so the first sort of sense was to create a sort of building that where the roof would be, let's say, one of the main facades, because that would be what you would see as you come up. And the idea was to kind of, let's say, embrace this idea of representation, but represent the country through its landscape. And so the architecture is kind of carved with 5 courtyards, really. I mean, 3 courtyards and 2 smaller ones, where each courtyard is one of the kind of ecosystem of Gabon. And through that carving, to really sort of integrate also the building with the landscape around through the kind of management of the water. The water is collected on the roof and then kind of used in the courtyards, and then kind of filtered through the different kind of small ponds around the site, and then again kind of reused inside the building for grey water, toilets, etc. And so this is the kind of entrance view, the kind of more ceremonial entrance view, and the idea that the sort of negotiation between inside and outside also carries to the facade, where it's a double facade. The outer one being made of louvers and sort of creating a sense of transparency, and then the inner one more closed and opaque. This is a mock-up we did for the facade. The stone is a limestone, local limestone as well, and to really kind of push this idea of a transparency that changes the louvers kind of move from more closed to more open. Since the Gabon is really on the equator, the sun is always kind of quite vertical, and it rains a lot, but nevertheless gets quite hot. And so here are the voids and kind of landscapes on the facade, and in between the two skins is this kind of promenade, which we thought would be really good for informal meetings. So after you would be in one of the conference rooms and have a sort of very formal meeting, formal presentations, you could take a walk around the building and sort of resolve problems diplomatically. And so being in between the two skins, you can either look out onto the landscape beyond the building or look in towards the courtyards, one of the courtyards. And the entire kind of the double skin is entirely sort of negotiating entrances and perforations, etc. So here you see really the sort of the two skins and then the kind of topographies, and the courtyards. Each one is quite specific and breaks really the sort of abstraction of the big circle. This is the waterfall courtyard, which is where the kind of water comes to be filtered, and is really the sort of rainforest landscape, which is here. You also have the Inselberg courtyard, which is drier and more stone-like, and then the orchard where we're growing coffee and other agricultural sort of species. So that's the waterfall here, and this is a mock-up we did in Vermont, where we calibrated the sort of shape, the kind of form of the water falling, and this is the again the kind of Inselberg, which is the kind of drier one. I don't know what happened here. Is the orchard one, which is kind of more suspended, and each kind of courtyard sort of eats up at the perimeter of the circle. The in-between space is kind of very open, and then in the middle is the main auditorium that is sort of caught in this hexagon, which is actually the sort of trace of the conference center that was there before. We initially proposed to preserve the existing conference center and build around it, but as the project developed, it became more and more difficult to keep the structure, and so now we just had the kind of trace of it. But here you see the sort of courtyards that are sort of interrupting the sort of much more undifferentiated kind of white space in between the hexagon and the courtyards. Here's the lobby, again, sort of with a sort of more modernist feel, but again, sort of the kind of surprise of the underside of the courtyards, and using the hexagon as a kind of lantern to light up the kind of surface of the gold of the courtyards. The feeling of the outside carries to the conference center, where the roof is a sort of inverted topography that kind of resonates with the water being collected here at the top. And each venue inside is really thought of as being connected, both literally but also in terms of, let's say, atmosphere to the courtyards outside. So under the orchard auditorium is you are on the orchard garden. You are in the auditorium and kind of experience the weight of the kind of earth above you. This is the rainforest auditorium, working with the kind of glass tubes to create a sense of a clearing. And the Inselberg has a view onto the Inselberg auditorium garden. And finally, the only one that's not connected to an actual garden is the press room, but where the geometries of the facade, which is a kind of cone, and the geometry of the room intersect to create this sort of Turrell-like shape at the corner. So there's a kind of registered of the two geometries. And at the top is just the restaurant with a view onto the landscape beyond. And my favorite is the mechanical system. Just my favorite. And it's under construction, moving slowly, but moving nevertheless. These are the piles. So I don't know, maybe we just do one more. So White and Kennedy is the image you have on the poster, I think, is the ad agency that did our ads for Nature City. Very sort of interested. They did all the ads for Nike. They were originally from Portland, so are interested in kind of have a sort of I don't know how to call it, touchy, woody sort of aesthetic, and yeah. But since after Portland have grown to become a kind of global ad agency network, and what was interesting, one of the interesting parts of the project is that they took 3 floors of a building on Barrack Street, but nevertheless wanted a presence on the street, and so. That was kind of one of the challenges. So a few things we were interested in. Again, density, a sense of connection between the 3 floors without necessarily creating kind of atrium. We wanted to move away to do something really urban, New York-like, moving away from, let's say, the sprawling feeling of a Google kind of experience. We wanted to move away from work as playground and come back to a sort of work as work, you know, and also try to really kind of study in the same way that we studied nature cities, really look at the density of the office space to try and increase the density of the individual stations while maximizing the kind of more collective shared space between the workers. And we did that by really fine-tuning distances between desks and columns, etc., and managed to create go from 6% of shared space to 25% of kind of shared open space between in the office. And so continuing with the idea of shared space, we really did a kind of study of the meeting environments according to time. So what is a 5-minute meeting? What is a half an hour? What is 3 hours? And how each kind of time can require a different type of meeting spaces and not have the same for everything. And so that went from the scale of a phone booth where you just need to make a quick call, you don't need a big room, to the scale of a whole sort of amphitheater-like stair where you can have all agency meetings, such as this one. So a real kind of study of work environments. And so here is the project where these are the kind of meeting rooms. These are the over-the-counter meeting tables. So these are like for the 10-minute meeting, quick meeting, standing. And these are elevated are the lounges, which are sort of somewhere in between. You don't need a closed room, but you need some level of privacy. And here's the woodsy sensibility that I was talking about. And what's interesting about the different elevations of the lounges is that you do have a sense of privacy, even though it's not enclosed, just by being a little bit higher up. So this is a phone booth scale, and this is a conference room. This is homage to the Whitney conference room with the lights. Meeting also in cafeteria space. So the meeting rooms really just structure the kind of more open space and create these neighborhoods where we broke down the scale where each 25 people, for every 25 people, you get a phone booth, a meeting room, a lounge, and a kind of direct access to one of the larger spaces. And so the diagram of carving at least 4 very, very big moments, the kind of biggest collective shared moments out of the more generic became the sort of diagram for the project, but also how to connect that, again, without embracing the sort of atrium, and using the circle, which by now you should know, as the most efficient way to cut in between the columns. Here you get the largest, biggest size opening, in between the 4 columns. So we only had to remove 1 column. And again, our Mata Clark obsession of kind of cutting these holes to create this sense of connection with this big stair, which is the main meeting spaces for all agency meetings. Here, kind of very sort of monumental and present from all of the different areas. Here you see the stair. So that hole kind of connects to that hole, and that was the way for us to have a sense of the 3 floors and the sense of connection, but not an immediate, very obvious sense of connection in the all agency meeting. So from the big stair, you go to the bar. They have a lot of parties, and then here, and that takes you to a spiral stair, which then takes you to the kind of library den at the top here. And this being an ad agency, they have a gym. We did a gym. We couldn't resist the gym. But the gym and have it. But the gym sort of doubles also as a meeting and kind of black box space where all of the seating is hidden in here, and you can kind of open it up. And finally, with regards to the presence on the street, we sort of moved the facade from the outside to just a bay inside and created these sort of double height courtyard, which they've been using for everything from working to yoga, for example, and is kind of really interesting at night when they have events. You can see the building. I think I'll stop here.
We will now open the floor to questions. Anybody?
Hi, thank you for a wonderful lecture. I was remembering the wonderful diagram you showed us at the start, also a circle, but the circle of power with the architect operating. And I was wondering whether you could tell us a little bit of how you, as the architect, negotiate power, and perhaps if it influences which clients you seek out. Thank you.
That's a great question. I think that sort of goes back a little bit to what Anna was saying, in the sense that I think we are refusing to be pessimistic about the ability for architects to meaningfully engage. And I think that it's been a combination of seeking some kind of work and doing research, doing certain kinds of research, which then creates new audiences. Or for us, the best example would be we did this research called 49 Cities, where we looked at sort of cities and in relation to visionary cities through a kind of ecological lens, looking at how even in kind of visionary cities there was always a sense of where the food was coming from, of the kind of idea of how much open space was required. It was really kind of part of it. And that really led to PS1, which was the urban farm, and that sort of opened up a series of real projects with the Edible Schoolyards and working with Alice Waters and being involved in public schools. And so that's kind of one line of work that's been quite important for us. And I think that with every project, we try to bring a sort of, if I think of New Holland Island, even though we are in negotiation or with the city, it's also very developer-driven. So I would say that the strategy is not just architectural, it's also a kind of infrastructural strategy to try to maintain a kind of public experience at the ground and at the roof, that the buildings need to be, that probably may not work, but we kind of maintained that. So it's a kind of commitment to trying to, if we can't have a kind of agency to carve some value for a larger public, let's say, or define what that public might be, or create, with Nature City, it was, the idea that if someone could look at the model and say, I would live there, that would be already a positive. So it's just a kind of stubborn belief that we, even if we fail, we need to
Hi. Your talk was great. I appreciated it a lot. Could you comment on your work with either your research with landscape architects or permaculturist specialists, horticulturists, and how that has influenced your work, or how that contributes to your view of the future of collaborative practice?
Yeah, that's so. One of the things that came out of PS1 in particular, because that was the first time, is when we wrote Above the Pavement, the Farm, it was not to describe the project, but to describe the process, which became about this collaboration with a network of farmers, scientists, artists, this guy who created this foamy fake earth to grow. So it was really incredible to discover that world and realize how much collaboration and conversation there is there relative to, let's say, the level of collaboration we might have with other architects, etc. It's a very different atmosphere, and that has really been inspiring for us in a sense that we try to do that with every project. So in Gabon, it was we invited our favorite landscape architect to work, within our office, and so I don't claim expertise. I think that we know where our, I think landscape architecture is its own thing, but the idea that collaboration becomes something that is almost natural is kind of very important to our ethos as a kind of firm. So.
Thank you for the lecture, Amal. I want to go back to Ana Maria's question, perhaps actually about the relationship between the architect and power, and ask you to elaborate a little bit more on what you meant by architecture as diplomacy. And let me just sort of share a few ideas with you and see if they resonate with your understanding of it. And especially that you have mentioned developers, because it seems to me that what has changed in the last 20 or 30 years is that the main client of architects working in the public domain has moved from being state or state agencies to actually being more and more developers. And I would have thought that the architect's agency in the earlier model would have been similar to sort of like the wise advisor, the philosopher for the philosopher-king relationship, because the architect was dealing with the king. And I don't know how to actually qualify or to imagine the new relationship. But in the one project, that kids' school that you showed us, the model that came to my mind was Robin Hood. And I wonder if you can comment on that.
The libraries, or, you know, there's such a thing called the Robin Hood libraries.
Yeah, but I mean, Robin Hood is actually the agency of the architect as a Robin Hood.
Yeah. That's a hard question. It's a great question. We struggle, everybody's struggling with. Honestly, I don't think we can win with developers unless there is a commitment to something other than profit. I really, it's just not going to work. So that's why I think for us it's also strategic to. I'm not saying it in a cynical way. I really believe that environmental concern can be a shared kind of ground zero for conversation. So, and not greenwashing. I mean, like kind of so. It might be a small territory, but it's at least a kind of beginning where you could say, well, we can't do that because, you know, or, and that's what that's been our diplomatic sort of toolbox. But I must say we don't work with many developers. I mean, I think 90% or more of our work is institutions, city in New York. You know, the conference center is government. We'd love to do more governmental projects, even though they have their own issues as well. Now you get these kind of big firms involved, and I really, if the bottom line is profit. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay. I hope it's not a difficult one, but I was thinking of it as sort of the question that would be called scaling the circle or something like that. But for me, I feel your desire to speak about, engage, and even work through the agency of the architect. What I would like to hear about more a little bit is the agency of form in the production of this architecture.
Yeah, that's very good. Well, we have a limited toolbox that we've been kind of working through. I think that there's a genuine resistance to formal complexity as we've seen it in the past generation, partly because it's become so corporate. And I would also say that there is now for us something about it. Can you create a complexity of experience through simpler forms? So a lot of it has become a kind of we've multiplied the circles. We've used it as a void or a doubling up or. We haven't theorized it much, but I think we multiply the numbers of operations, but they remain quite simple. The only thing I would say is that I think that there's the agency of form, but we've also been interested in systems. Yeah, okay.
I'll try to follow up on that last question. Thanks for the talk. You know, I guess there's been a divide that has unfolded, and you know, it's sort of interesting because MIT has been a part of it in the 1960s and 70s, where somehow architecture got chopped up, And there was a vector that went off towards kind of social concerns and perhaps later environmental concerns when kind of environmental movement got invented. And then there was another group that went in a different direction that was more occupied, let's say, with type or with form. And what I think is sort of interesting about your work, and what I was thinking of when Anna asked that question, is that you seem to be wanting to, perhaps without expressing it, rejoin those streams and say that there can be a abstract formal language, for a building that's about courtyards or about breathability or water or other ecological concerns. And I think it's kind of cool that you don't back away from that. Can you comment on that? Am I way off base?
Sure, I'll
it might be way off base on that. I don't know.
No, not at all. I think we've definitely wanted to join both, and but I also feel that that separation maybe happened here. I mean, it happened. It's very localized. It's it's very American. It's very maybe Berkeley versus it is east-west. But that's why I think we were inspired, in particular in Gabon, or when we think about kind of tropical modernism, or there is this abstraction, but there is also this negotiation of climate and systems, and there is an abstraction, but kind of bringing things together and still contributing to some kind of meaning, let's say. And I think that we find that quite inspiring. So.
I guess this is a follow-up to the follow-up question. I'll try. Listen, I find your work in many ways very liberating. You free us of the dichotomies that Sheila speaks of, if I can extend that. The way that you bring Venturi Scott Brown into the work suggests a kind of overcoming of the easy dichotomy between architecture and interior decoration, and I mean this in the best way. And then many of the works also seem to try to reconcile, or maybe not, but work with the formal agency of strong form on the one hand, but also fragment the work into a series of installations which give you a freedom to do almost anything within. So my question to you ultimately is, where do you construct resistance or friction within your own work? What are you not willing to do? And to what degree is yours a project of ease, opportunism, and a kind of laissez-faire, as long as you can do whatever installation it is within your own work? And how do you construct resistance within your work?
That's a good question. Maybe we're just easy. I think we're still attached, maybe not with the courtyards, but we're still attached to certain legibility. I mean, kind of legibility of figures, or it's hard for us to abandon that. So maybe there's certainly some resistance there. I think the courtyards was the first time we sort of went into other territory. I think the installations are it's a nice way to the resistance is there's hierarchy also, so that contributes to the legibility. I think that so the installations can exist as long as there's a bigger hierarchy. I don't know. I have to think about how we. I mean, ultimately, we still work with diagrams, right? And so there's a tension that's set by the diagram that then we can only break exceptionally, let's say. So that is also a resistance there. Maybe that's the strongest one. So.
Does that feel like a good place to end, or you want one more?
I'll take one more.
Nader's question. Oh, yeah, I mean, it just keeps going, and I'm so sorry for that. So he was talking about the laissez-faire and resistance, and you kind of gave a very formal answer. But earlier you were talking about how you have, no room, not no room for developers, but it's hard to work for developers in this area. You kind of given up on them. You're also sort of...
I'm speaking as a dean.
No. Okay, well, I was going to say, you are stepping into the lion's den, and how do you feel that being a practitioner, which sort of anchors you into practice in a way that perhaps your predecessor was able to skirt those problems? How do you feel going in?
I feel great. I am an optimist. I'm a stubborn optimist. I really, again, I think that we just have to keep repeating that this is what we want to do, and this is how we want to do it. And sometimes you're going to find someone who is going to work with you. I don't know what else to say.
I think that's a good place to end.
But actually, just to finish, she's a Beiruti, basically. That's what she's
It's a reverse oriental movement right now happening in,
It is.
Thank you, Amale.